I just saw M. Night Shyamalan's Old, and before I get started talking about this one, the way that I feel about his other movies are as follows. I love The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, Signs in the Village are both okay, Lady in the Water and The Happening are both hilarious and terrible, Last Airbender is just weird and I don't like it, After Earth is bad but also funny, The Visit is bad but not funny, so kind of worse, Split is okay, and Glass is, I think, by far his worst one. I hate Glass. And so now we have Old, and this is in the category of Lady in the Water and The Happening. This is hilarious and terrible. There are so many things to talk about with this movie. I'm actually kind of excited about this. So let's get right into it. So a brief summary of Old. This is a movie where a bunch of people wind up on a beach, and at this beach they age very rapidly and they cannot escape. Why is this movie terrible? There are a lot of reasons. I don't want to blame anyone except M. Night Shyamalan for what I'm about to say, because I'm about to criticize the acting in this movie. Across the board, it is pretty terrible. And I don't think that that's anybody's fault in particular, except for the bad direction that they were given. Because you have this main character, who, by the way, his name is Guy. That's very upsetting to me. You can't think of a different name other than Guy for your main character. That's Gael Garcia Bernal. He's not great. The wife isn't great. Everybody's a cartoon character in this, and there's no clear sense of who these people are supposed to be. And a part of the reason for that is the dialogue that they're given. Now, this is very common with M. Night Shyamalan movies, where the dialogue is very, very signature to his movie, also known as bad dialogue. So when we talk about this in Old, what I'm referring to is mostly how everything that the characters said, did, expressed, anything like that, had to directly tie into their occupation. So like I said, there's a doctor. Everything that he says is about how he's a doctor and how stressful it is to be a doctor. There's this one dude who is a nurse, and he only talks about how great it is to be a nurse and how I'm a nurse and I do nursey things. Gael Garcia Bernal is an actuary, which means that all he does is just cite very random and useless statistics. I hate it. It's awful. Even worse, the worst of every single one of these is the wife. All she does is talk about how she works in a museum. And it turns out if you work in a museum, you will be able to exposit every bit of unnecessary exposition to the audience, which is great. I cannot wait to start my lifelong career working in museums so I can condescend to strangers on a beach. All that she did in the movie is just walk around and say, oh, the reason that this is happening is because blah, 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 blah. The reason that we're aging so rapidly, and was able to do the math on the rapid aging, and she's able to talk about, oh, it's supposed to take 7 years, but it only happened in 30 minutes, which means that every 30 minutes it must be 1 year that passes by. Blah, 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 blah. It was a bit infuriating, but it was equally funny. That's my hard stance on the movie. Everything that happened was bad, but equally funny. You were able to very easily laugh at this movie. Depending on how you look at it, it could be pretty fun or pretty sad. The entire theater that I was in, I'm almost certain was on the exact same page, because as I turned around walking out of the theater, I looked at everybody and they all had the exact same confused bullshit face that I did, meaning that they all thought what I thought. Is that how that works? I don't know. That seems like bad logic to me, but I'm going to roll with it. Anyway, another part of this movie I want to talk about is the makeup, because the whole concept relies around these people aging throughout the movie. And so you would think that at the beginning of the movie, they would look younger than at the end of the movie. The only time that this works is with the children, because what they do with the children is they start off as, 6 years old or 11 years old. Then what they do is they recast them with older actors. This is effective because those actors are indeed older than the children that are younger than them. Surprise, surprise. The thing with the adults is that they do not do this. The adult actors remain the same throughout the whole thing. So, what are some solutions to this? You would think that you might want to start off with some younger age makeup on them in the beginning, and then maybe gradually build up to what they actually look like, and then by the end of the movie, they would look much, much older. I think that this is what they thought they accomplished. However, this is not at all what they accomplished in this movie, because what ended up happening instead is they gave everybody crow's feet and a little bit of wrinkles along the face and neck, and then that was it. There was no other aging makeup. And the thing that's so infuriating about this is I've seen some excellent age makeup recently, and it was in I'm Thinking of Ending Things. 2 characters in that movie were young, old, and everything in between, and the makeup did nothing but convince me of their age. And in this movie, the makeup did nothing but distract me, and part of the reason is because I could actually see the outline of where the makeup was applied as opposed to where it was not applied. I also noticed that the makeup was only applied from the neck up, so anything from the shoulders down was not changed whatsoever that I was able to notice. So you have this person walking around, and you're supposed to believe that they're 60, but they're walking around with the legs of a 30-year-old. Now you might think, well, that's not a big deal. Why are you noticing something like this? Well, I'll tell you why. Because there is this old woman at the beginning of the movie who goes onto this beach. She's the first to die because she ages so quickly. When you get really old, sometimes you get sunspots on your skin, and your skin just naturally ages and starts to sag and wrinkle. And this woman, because she was older, she did have the little bit of the saggy skin, the sunspots everywhere, so you know what an old person's body is actually supposed to look like. So when you see someone with really tight skin around their calves, like young people have, it was really upsetting for them to pan up and look at a 60-year-old face with really bad aged makeup. I don't understand how they overlooked this detail. You could have very easily applied the makeup to the entire body, but that is not something they did. I hate this movie. So another thing that I don't like are the characters. I already mentioned the dialogue. I already mentioned how they don't speak like people. They speak like M. Night Shyamalan thinks people speak, which is not people speak. The way that these characters behave and interact with one another is as equally infuriating as it is hilarious. Again, a very common theme throughout this movie. And one of my favorite examples of this is at the very beginning, before they even get to the beach, where the doctor and the nurse are having a conversation over the nurse's wife's body. So the nurse's wife, who I think was a therapist or something, she has epilepsy, so she tends to have seizures quite often in the movie. During the first seizure that we see her have, she's just flailing around on a concrete floor somewhere, and the nurse is saying, "It's okay, I'm a nurse, this is my wife, we've been married for a long time, I'm familiar with how to deal with this. Sorry to ruin everybody's breakfast." And the doctor comes over and says, "Well, no, hold on just a second, I'm a doctor, I know more than you are, you need to take care of your wife this way, this way, this way, that way." And he decides to totally mansplain this guy's wife's condition, even though he knows nothing of the situation, and he's a cardiologist. What does he know about epilepsy that the guy who is married to the woman with epilepsy wouldn't know? I don't understand. And it's constant interactions like this that don't make any sort of logical sense, that are so bizarre. I don't understand how this guy comes up with these types of ideas. And you have these constantly. Again, this heart doctor perform abdomen surgery against like cancer or something. You have the kids who, again, this is an M. Night movie, so of course the kids will not speak like children. That is asking too much. The kids speak super, super weird. And then when they start to age, there's this one part where these two are at this point hitting puberty, and they're discovering all of these feelings, and they're talking about, "Oh my god, I'm thinking about the world in a totally different way now. Is this what being horny is like? This is so bizarre and magical. I love growing. This is fun. We should do something about it." And then they just fuck in the tent, and then they come out, and now this girl is pregnant. Again, I'd like to iterate, these were 6-year-old children who are now pregnant and 20 minutes later give birth. I don't understand what's happening at all. I think that it's time that I talk about the twist, because the twist opens up a lot of plot holes that I really want to get into. If you don't want to know the end of the movie before going into it, here is your warning. The twist of this movie is that these people were brought to the beach deliberately to be experimented on by the resort that they were staying at. And it turns out it wasn't a resort at all. It was a super secret medical laboratory where they were testing drugs on people to examine the long-term effects of these drugs on people without having to wait the actual amount of time. Because like I said, every day is 50 years or something like that. So they're able to test drugs on epileptic people. They're able to test drugs on schizophrenic people. They're able to examine the effects of cancer over the course of 30 years, which is actually just a couple hours. This is not an inherently uninteresting twist. I actually kind of like the idea of it. It's really interesting because it makes some level of sense. Okay, yeah, we found this place and now we're just taking people there to experiment stuff. I do have a question though. If they were experimenting on all these different things to try and cure whatever diseases, how come they didn't even once experiment with the cure for aging? They have all of these people there. This is the 74th trial or whatever they said. So why didn't once in these past 70 times did they try to cure aging? They already gave all these people a cocktail for their specific drug. So why didn't they give each of them a cocktail for anti-aging? Maybe they could have prolonged life. They could have solved death, but instead they were too busy on being like, hey, you know what, buddy, guess what? We did it. We cured seizures, and frankly, I am thrilled. Give me a round of applause. That's the twist, which means that all these people were just kind of kidnapped from their homes at one point and brought to this beach. The way they explain all of this is that there's this magic rock on the beach, and some way, somehow, the rock affects the aging of cells, but don't worry, it doesn't affect the way your hair grows or the way your nails grow, because those are dead cells, and it only affects living cells, and we're living, so our hair is fine. But what he neglects to talk about is skin, because skin cells die very, very rapidly, and it turns out people actually shed a lot of skin in a very short amount of time. So how come these guys weren't just raining skin the entire time? They should have been shedding like snakes constantly, but they weren't. It's almost like he forgot to explain away that one. He didn't forget to explain away anything else, so I don't understand what's happening, M. Night, huh? How come their skin isn't falling off? Another weird thing that wasn't super explained is every time they try to leave the beach, they all black out and then wind up back at the beach, because the way that the rocks are magicked, they can't leave the beach, and so they just come right back. But then, how did they discover this beach in the first place? And how is it that if these rocks make everything around them age super, super rapidly, how come M. Night Shyamalan is able to stand up on the very top of a cliff overlooking everything and can just say, hey, you know what? I can observe them from here and not age a single day. I don't know how that works. What is the range of power on these rocks? It's almost like you forgot to explain that too, kind of like how you over-explained everything else, but you didn't forget to over-explain that. So what's going on? Which brings me to one of my favorite Shyamalan-isms in the movie, and that is M. Night Shyamalan himself. He likes to put himself in cameo roles in the movies. Sometimes they're just little throwaway roles, sometimes they're larger parts like in Lady in the Water. I think that this is arguably his largest part, other than Lady in the Water, where he wrote himself as a literal Jesus who would save the world. In this one, he's the guy who drives everybody to the beach and then records observations on them, and he does a terrible job, because at the very end, when they're trying to escape, and they do successfully escape, he just decides to leave well before they could have actually drowned, ends up blowing the entire operation. So congratulations, M. Night, you went from writing yourself as Jesus to writing yourself as the criminal enterprise's undoing. The last thing I want to talk about before I wrap this up is how bad this movie looks. I mean that in a few different ways. The first way is the visual effects. I think that the visual effects on this are very poorly done, specifically in the way that they are lit in comparison with the way that everything else is lit. You can tell that they were done in a computer. I don't know if it was they weren't given enough time to match the lighting to the real world elements, or if this was a problem where they weren't given enough money, or they just had a completely skewed vision, there wasn't enough communication. I don't know what the issue was, but the effect is that we have very bad VFX. The rocks in this movie don't look real at all. Anytime that someone interacts with them, it looks very fake. The sets are all pretty obvious when they're on this beach. Another thing is the camera and the way that it moves around kind of aimlessly. M. Night Shyamalan's previous movies, he'll do these long takes, and in movies like Unbreakable and The Sixth Sense, these are very purposeful. They add to the story and they add to the characters within the scene. And in this movie, all it does is just meander, and it doesn't focus on any one thing, and it's very disorienting and confusing. An example of this is when the mom has cancer and it's growing really rapidly and they're performing surgery to get it out. What they do with the camera is they just point it up at the sky and they don't show us anything interesting going on. 30% of the frame is taken up by the foreheads of characters, whereas the other 70% is just the sky. And you have problems like this all the time where it seems to be focusing on the wrong thing. It doesn't even focus on the reaction of the characters because they're not framed up in the shot properly. It's almost like this guy doesn't know anything about shot composition, because when the camera moves around, it just seems like someone lost control of it while it was on a dolly track and it started spinning around, and eventually someone caught it and brought it back. But I don't understand how this made it to the edit room. How did you not have room for another take where you could at least pull the focus properly? Because there's a few shots in here that are out of focus and I can't see what's going on. Oh my god, it was so frustrating, because as if it were hard enough to follow what was going on, because the story and the plot got to be so confusing because he felt the need to overanalyze and over-explain every minute detail of what was going on, most of which I wasn't even interested in. He also decided to frame it in a way to where I couldn't see what was going on, so now I couldn't understand what was happening in my ears, I couldn't understand what was happening in my eyes, and I just wanted to bawl my eyes out. That's not true, but I was really frustrated. It was stupid. It really made this movie a lot worse. That's not to say this movie isn't without its good parts. There are are actually maybe one or two things that weren't too bad in this. And both of them were kind of near the end. They were the death scenes of the doctor and the doctor's wife. I thought that those were not too bad. The doctor's wife is this lady who talks about how she has a calcium deficiency. And so when she's talking at the beginning of the movie, she says, does this meal actually come with high calcium, or does it just say it comes with high calcium? I have a calcium problem. Audience, did you hear me? I have a calcium problem. I wonder if that'll pay off later. Turns out it did pay off later, and what happened was her bones became so brittle they just broke all the time. But another thing, she had this very weird calcium deposit on her back. She looked like the Hunchback of Notre Dame by the end of this thing. It was fucking bizarre. The scene where she dies is actually really good body horror if it wasn't predicated on all the goofy shit that came before, because I was laughing during the entire scene. I thought it was very funny that she killed herself with a rock and then died because she was just wriggling around and her bones kept breaking as she was trying to support herself. Visually, if I were just watching that moment out of context, it's pretty effective body horror, and it was really cool to look at, but it was surrounded by this god-awful context that did nothing but just make it seem very, very goofy. The other death was of the doctor, who turned out to be a schizophrenic, and he was always asking about this Jack Nicholson Marlon Brando movie for some reason. He was kind of like the guy in The Happening who kept asking about hot dogs.
We're packing hot dogs for the road. You know, hot dogs get a bad rap. They got a cool shape, they got protein. You like hot dogs, right?
It was a tick that didn't make any sense, but by the end of it, he's trying to kill Gael Garcia Bernal, and the wife comes up and she slices him with a rusty knife because they found some rusty hotel equipment earlier. She's like, hey, guess what? That knife was rusty, which means that the rust is now in your blood, which means that you're now infected with the blood disease and you're gonna die. He dies, and it's kind of a cool effect where you see the things spread all over his body, and I like that. But that cool thing was not only surrounded by poor context because it was hilarious that Gael Garcia Bernal was going completely blind while his wife was going completely deaf. It's also surrounded by the introduction of the rust affecting this man's blood. Here's what I mean by that. This knife has been used several times in the movie. It was used in a very bizarre, racist killing of the only black guy that was there. So the logic of this knife is that because it is rusty, your blood is now infected, and because we age so rapidly, that infection is going to spread much quicker than normal. Okay, I'm with you so far. Makes perfect sense. Now the problem is, now I have to assume that this knife that has been used the entire movie has been sterile the entire time, even after operating on a woman with cancer, stabbing a guy to death, slicing a guy all the time, and being buried and unburied in the sand, and also getting wet in the ocean. You're telling me that this blade is so sterile that there's no chance that any bit of even rock or sand got into the bloodstream of any other character? I call bullshit. I'm kind of exhausted talking about this movie. If you want to go see it, my recommendation is have something in your system. Get yourself a drink before seeing it and make sure that you can ride that buzz the entire time and just have fun with it. Because if you can laugh at this movie, you'll have fun. If you can't, you are in for an unfortunately painful and dreadful experience. I would give Old a 2 out of 10, and that's all I got to say about M. Night until he comes out with his next quote-unquote masterpiece. Take care.